All right, we are looking at lessons for South Africa from Venezuela. And Akash, the caveat, tell me if you agree with me, is that there is no doubt that Nicolas Maduro was ruining the economy of Venezuela. That began a long time ago, but we are not saying, by looking at the lessons for South Africa, that what the US did was right either, to go and displace him. That was a clear violation of international law. I'm just putting it out there. We're going to look at the economics of Venezuela. Do you agree?
Yeah. Look, I think the difficulty here is that he was an illegitimate leader because the elections were clearly stolen.
Yeah.
He was an authoritarian leader. So there was, no democracy. He destroyed the economy. There was widespread corruption. Was the Americans just in doing what they did? Well, probably not. But at the same time, where was the justice for ordinary people in Venezuela? Let's remember that millions of them fled the country. It's very similar to the situation in Zimbabwe, where people simply cannot afford to live there any longer. There are no opportunities. If you have little kids, every parent wants the best for their little kid, right? But if you live in Zimbabwe or you live in Venezuela, that's not going to happen. You have to find greener pastures.
Yeah, and there was a claim that South Africa, there's always been the claim that South Africa should have done more to put pressure on Zimbabwe. There is a lot you can do. Let's be clear, the US has not framed this as anything for the people of Venezuela. It's about the US and its oil and its influence in the West. But let's look at the economics. Venezuela, what is that saying? Going to hell in a handbasket. The economy was dire, and many blame that on socialism, the nationalism of mind. So we started talking about it yesterday. South Africa has not gone full Monty in terms of this, but tell me if you agree with me. There is a definite, there is an adherence for socialism, to socialism in this country that is pretty strong. And I was thinking about the former Eskom CEO, Andre de Ruyter, saying that only in South Africa does the ruling party call each other comrades. And I was laughing because Fikile Mbalula yesterday, the ANC Secretary General, was talking about Maduro's wife and said she is our comrade. So that wording is there. It comes from the Freedom Charter, the nationalism of the land would belong to the people on it, the wealth would be for the people. All good strains. That was freedom, liberation ideology at the time. Socialism was linked to freedom at the time. But yeah, you could say there's a strong strain in South Africa.
Look, I think on paper, socialism is really great because it advocates some level of equality, and that everybody should have equal access to resources, which is really good. But in practice, it simply doesn't work because time after time, we see that governments are simply not as good as the private sector in managing resources. We saw this in Venezuela as well. So the first wave of nationalism or nationalization happened, I think it was in the 1970s, where the oil companies were taken over. Not just the oil companies, the telecommunications sector, farming, mines and minerals, all of it was taken over. And then Hugo Chavez came in the 2000s, and basically everything was put under government control. And it was after that we saw something happen which is really worrying, which was hyperinflation, 1,000% in 2018. And I think, Francis, that's where in South Africa we've done something right, especially when it comes to managing inflation.
Yeah, and most would argue that we have a capitalist system, right? I was thinking about Venezuela, and then I'll make the link to South Africa, in terms of one oil operation. So the state takes over that oil operation. For a while, before Hugo Chavez, apparently it was still state-owned, but it was allowed to excel, one of the big operations. But then the state comes in, and of course, there's always that temptation for politicians to reward their friends. So you can land up having the CEO of that oil operation being politically connected, rather than hopefully in many operations, you'd get the best technical person, engineer, the most knowledgeable, the best manager, rising to the top. So you now have people who are inefficient, who are being politically rewarded. You also then have a situation where the state can take that money, the oil curse, because the state is no longer accountable to taxpayers because it's getting this great source of revenue from that oil. So it doesn't have to worry about the people. It doesn't have to worry about institutions. We have not done that. But remember, even Zuma spoke about cadre deployment. And there has been political reward for people who sit at the top of SOEs. That's become a reward that could be given by the ANC. The ANC has recognized that it has affected municipalities because you have somebody at the top sometimes who is there because of their political connections rather than their efficiency.
And look, that's natural. I mean, if you think about it, even the DA, when they took over the Western Cape, or when they took over the city of Cape Town, they appointed people who they could work with. They appointed people within their ranks. Chris Papas in KwaZulu-Natal did exactly the same thing. He brought in people he could work with. I guess the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, how deep do we go into this? And the problem that arose in South Africa is that you had cadre deployment at too many different levels. So, for example, if you look at a dysfunctional municipality, a lot of the time it's due to the fact that cadres who are simply not equipped to handle those particular positions and the responsibilities that came with those positions being parachuted into them. Yeah. The SETAs in South Africa is another great example. I mean, the SETAs on paper is a really noble endeavor, but in reality, it has simply failed because it's become an easy way to pay people who simply towed the party line.
And the SOEs, and it has also been argued, and I've actually always believed in BEE. Apartheid was so skewed to some parts of the population that you couldn't just make things fair. I think you had to have some sort of redress. But the way it's been implemented, again, at times, it's been a political reward. So I was looking back at it.
A political reward for a small number of people rather than the majority benefiting, right? And that's exactly what happened in Venezuela. You've got a few people benefiting and the majority simply left out of the system.
Yeah, because if everybody owns the wealth, right, the state usually takes charge. And that is what happens. I was thinking of that old case, 2010, Goldfields. And the ANC was accused of dictating who the BEE partners would be. So foreign investors have been coming into South Africa, and off the record, I've been told it is very difficult because you come into South Africa and then you face these hurdles and then you have to give up parts of your shareholding. Now, it's different if you can choose who those shareholders are. If in practice the party, which at that stage it came out, was basically dictating who those shareholders should be, and it's a political reward, that becomes hard for the foreign investors.
And that's the point that Elon Musk is making right now, right?
Yeah.
Why should I have to give up 30% of Starlink to a South African consortium that has done nothing and doesn't deserve any of the benefits that could accrue? And on one hand, yeah, absolutely. On the other hand, it also begs the question, how then do we address the imbalances that were created as a result of apartheid? And in fact, if you want to go slightly deeper, is redress even possible? Is equality even possible? Because there'll always be some level of inequality in the system. I think the one thing that those who believe in a market economy would argue is that a rising tide lifts all ships. And if the economy is doing well and the economy is creating jobs, the end result will be more people are able to find work and able to earn a living. The dilemma, though, is how much is enough? Because for some people, just a job is not good enough, right? For some entrepreneurs, we need to be multimillionaires. We've now come to a point in South Africa, we need to be multi-billionaires. So how much is enough? And I guess that's also the problem that faced the people in Venezuela.
So looking at South Africa now, there has been, because I'd love to look, I know you know some of the facts about Venezuela, and we can look at South Africa. South African mining is also in decline. The oil industry in Venezuela declined. We can look at some of the figures. South African mining is in decline, even though there's been these wonderful prices, which we were discussing, for gold and platinum over time, mine operations have shut down. Investors have left. They've argued sometimes that it's due to regulation, over-regulation, things that are imposed of them. Right now, there's another fight over a new bill the government is putting in. And remember, it played out in the courts, whether the miners are once empowered, if they do a BEE deal at the start, if that lasts forever. But what if those BEE partners want to sell? Are you then always empowered? Are you always considered a BEE mine? Or do you now have to get new partners on? The law said, the judges said, once empowered, always empowered. The new bill overturns that. So the DA is arguing that means you have to inject new BEE partners all the time. It's going to play out in the courts. And again, there's limbo. And again, there's concern about regulation, even the state being too involved in mining. And the minister himself has been accused of sending investors packing, basically, over recent years.
So, a short while ago, I said that the one thing that we got right in South Africa is we targeted inflation. The second thing that I think democratic South Africa did, which was really good, is we adopted a constitution. Because many of the things that you speak about that happened in Venezuela simply didn't happen in South Africa because there was always pushback. We always had a relatively independent judiciary. You had all these Chapter 9 institutions also. And at the end of the day in South Africa, we have a firm belief in freedom of expression. I think to myself that even at the height of the criticism that former President Jacob Zuma received, he never once tried to put people in prison because they were speaking out against him. None of our presidents have done that. And I think that's the major difference between South Africa and Venezuela, that in South Africa, we have a constitution that we can fall back on. And I think that's something that the rest of the world can learn from.
And we have to guard it and we have to protect it. And this fight about the mining bill that's been put on the table will play out in the courts. Interestingly enough, many are arguing for equity equivalence, like Elon Musk. Well, that would be the solution, right? He can invest in things that help people in South Africa rather than giving up shares to certain South Africans. And many are calling for that in the mining industry. So that'll be interesting. Venezuela, just to give you a few little numbers, Hugo Chavez came in by mid-2010, oil production in decline. In the late 1990s, they were producing 3 million barrels of oil per day. Last year, less than 1 million. Now, less than 1 million. We were saying 1% of the world's total supply.
And I mean, you can almost correlate that with what happened with Eskom. There was a time when Eskom was producing more than enough electricity to meet South Africa's demands. And then at some point, due to a number of different reasons, including the fact that we simply did not plan sufficiently for our population explosion that we saw, there simply wasn't enough. There wasn't enough electricity being generated, and then you had a whole lot of issues with the fact that power plants were not being properly maintained. Then there was corruption, very similar to what happened in the situation in Venezuela with their oil industry. And again, a slightly deeper question: how do we get on top of? How do we defeat this monster of corruption? What are we as a society, as a people, doing that even as parents, that we raise children who become corrupt? How do we change that? Not just in South Africa, but in Venezuela and in so many other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, you're right, because it's also about culture, right? It's not only ideology. You can have countries where the social democracies, where the state does look after education and does look after healthcare, and it does it well and creates the safety net. Or you can do it where the capitalists are doing better. For example, in South Africa, the private sector is doing better in running things. But sometimes it's about culture. Do we tolerate corruption? Do we tolerate inefficiency? And I love the argument, because you were saying yesterday that we are so attached to ideology in South Africa. I've seen rational arguments which say simply, who is doing better? Who is doing better in South Africa at running institutions? Is it the state or is it the private sector? And there's your answer. If it's the private sector, the state should not be extending its tentacles into more areas. And there should be concern over the national health insurance. not because it's not a noble idea, but because it will be run by a state that has not proven itself worthy in the past.
And that's the travesty, right? Because rich people always have their money to fall back on. You have a crime problem, well, you hire private security. You have an operation that you need to be done. You don't have to queue at Barra. You can go to a private hospital and pay via your medical aid. You worried about the failing education system in South Africa? Well, you put your kid into a private into a private school. Government should be stepping in to help those who can't help themselves, those who are less fortunate, who do not have the money. And you do that by taxing the rich and using their monies to make sure that you bring up those who don't have as much. And the travesty in this entire situation, South Africa and Venezuela, is that the government hasn't done that, because all the government has done is sought to enrich a few rather than uplift the vast majority of people.
Yeah, and the great irony is South Africa, given those socialist strains, I think we're still a capitalist country, but yeah, why is it a luxury to be healthy in this country? Why do you need money for good healthcare? Why is it a luxury to educate your children? Because the social democracies that work well, the idea is you provide good education and your kids can do better than you did. They will have a better chance in life. It's not their economic status that will determine their future if the state ensures there is good education. The fact is here, it is a luxury. A good education and healthcare, sometimes being alive, is a luxury.
And I think especially when it comes to education, our focus is too much on the end point rather than the beginning point, right? So we will use BEE to get jobs, and we'll use BEE to send kids to university. But surely the greater benefit would be if we just put a lot more money into properly resourcing schools, especially formerly disadvantaged schools, black schools. If we brought in better teachers, better resources, so that we gave every kid that was starting off an equal opportunity to get a good education. But we don't do that right now. You know, there are still kids that are studying under trees. There are still pit toilets in certain schools. We still have schools where kids have to walk huge distances just to get a basic education. And I think that's where we failed. I think BEE should be focused more at the start point when kids are young, and we should be investing in them a lot more heavily, because by the time we come out to the end of that education tunnel, perhaps it's already too late at that particular point.
No, I love that idea. And that's the idea of a safety net, where the state can play an important role, but it does not have to take over institutions and take over industry. It can allow those capitalist instincts to drive excellence. They do need to be contained. And maybe we can end off on this. I saw this beautiful quote, and I wish I knew who had brought this up. I can't remember, but looking at the United States, saying that capitalism perhaps has gone too far. And Lenin, who killed people in the name of socialism in Russia, said that the end of capitalism is imperialism. If the greed is not contained, it may end up where we're seeing the world going back to where might is right. And it's about power, and it's about economic power and other power.
I agree with you. And it's almost a natural trajectory, because when you think about it, in the years to come, when we colonize other planets, other asteroids, again, who's likely to do it? It's likely to be private companies, right? And you're going to see this corporatization of space. Governments will play a role, but ultimately, who's likely to land on Mars first?
Unless the US nationalizes Mars, or invades Mars after, or Elon Musk hands it over. But that's true. That would be unchecked if it's not owned by a state. But
this is also why we need a more just world order than the one that we have right now. And you started off by saying, we can talk about whether what Donald Trump did in Venezuela was right or wrong. And the answer is that to an extent he was wrong, and to an extent he was right. He was wrong because he broke the law as it is. But he was right because the people in Venezuela would never have been able to overthrow Maduro, who effectively stole their last election because he was an authoritarian, and there was nobody, not the United Nations. You know, I often think about the Yazidi people, you know, where the so-called Islamic State, you know, went out to wipe them out. And who came to their aid? Nobody. In Sudan right now, on our continent, there are people that are dying of famine because of a war that's happening there. Who's going to save them? Nobody. When M23 went into the Eastern DRC, who went and saved them? Nobody. So the current world order is unjust. The current world order is unjust.
Yeah, and look, I don't think this is about the people of Venezuela, because Maduro's cronies are still there. Many would argue you need change coming from within a country. I think this was completely arbitrary, whimsical, and based on America's interests. But you're right. The state can become authoritarian and the people suffer. And when we talk about economic ideology, people often think this is just ideology. But in Venezuela, where I agree with you, is that poverty can kill. Poverty can kill. If it's not through starvation, it's through the fact that your health care declines because the state is inefficient and you can't get life-saving medicine if you need it. You can't buy the things you need. So a state that mismanages the economy kills people. You're right in that.
And the problem with the state like the one in Venezuela, which is illegitimate and authoritarian, is that ordinary people simply do not have the means to get rid of the state. I mean, you look at Zimbabwe. You know what? Robert Mugabe stole that election in 2002. We're now 20 years later. Have the people of Zimbabwe been able to reclaim their democracy? No.
Yeah. And what has South Africa done about it?
Nothing. We initially maintained a policy of quiet diplomacy, which took us absolutely nowhere. And as a result, an entire generation of Zimbabwean children grew up with no hope. So this is an unjust world. It's an unfair world. What Trump did was equally fair. And all I can hope for is the one positive that comes out of this is that there is some sort of realignment, repositioning of the global system that allows a more just, a more fair world.
Sure. I think that's a strong hope, because many would say we are going in exactly the opposite direction. We're going back to imperialism, colonialism, a time where might is right. Very quickly, just some stats in South Africa. Gold production declined by 80% over 35 years. And of course, it's also because it becomes more and more difficult to go to find the gold the deeper you go in. It becomes more expensive, lives are lost. So it's not always. But there have been complaints about policy uncertainty for years. Platinum is in decline. 35% of platinum operations, if I'm right, closed between 1980, I must confirm these figures, and last year. And then the ferrochrome smelters, we've been talking about a jobs bloodbath. They are struggling. We used to deal with most of the ferrochrome used for steel, more than 50%. And now we're nowhere. And China's everywhere. And it's because of power prices. So Eskom's mismanagement coming home as well. So what would you end off with in terms of lessons for South Africa from Venezuela?
I think the first is continue to target inflation. The 3% target set by a Reserve Bank is fantastic, because if you don't, you'll end up with hyperinflation. And we saw the impact of that, not only in Venezuela, but in Zimbabwe as well. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second, which is something that our government has also done very well, is ensuring that we maintain a relatively prudent economic policy where we don't overspend ridiculously. And the great thing about South Africa in the current year, if I remember correctly, we have a budget deficit of just under 5%. But by the end of 2027, 2028, it goes to just over 3%, which is a lot better. And the third thing, love and protect our constitution, because it's the safeguard in times when leaders like despotic, autocratic leaders come about. It's our savior. So protect and love our constitution.
And I would end off with put the right people in the positions when we have to fix the institutions that have failed, and the municipalities.
Well, that's a subject of a whole new podcast,
Find wonderful, amazing people who can do the job. All right, let's end it there. That's a wrap.